you are. My name is Mushiri Nyaga from the Local Development Research Institute based in Nairobi, Kenya. And on behalf of the Data for Development Network, of which we are part of the Africa Hub, welcome to this State of Open. This is the third event in the third series of roundtables we've been holding as part of an effort to update the inaugural State of Open Data report published in 2019. Since then, a lot has happened across various sectors, across various geographies in relation to open data. Most of those are captured in the report. So you could, if you've not seen it, we'll put the link in the chat. And then the effort now has been to bring around the chairs, the chapter authors, and to chair these sessions, bring together other industry experts to essentially bring us up to speed on what has happened since the last episode, right? The inaugural report. And today we get to join a discussion on the state of open data in Sub-Saharan Africa. This session chair is Leonida Mutuku. She's research and strategy lead at LDRI, and she is CEO of Intelipro, an amazing data science company doing wonderful things. I'm sure she might tell you a little bit about that at some point. She'll introduce her panel and get the conversation started. So over to you,
Leo. Thank you so much, Mushiri, for the introduction. And I'm excited to host this roundtable with all of you. So as Mushiri mentioned, I do lead research and strategy at LDRI. And over the past number of years, have been working with a number of you probably in this space, as well as the Africa Open Data ecosystem, just to understand like how to make open data initiatives more sustainable. So we wrote a State of Open Data chapter in 2018 as part of a State of Open Data publication that traced a number of topics around the world. Our specific chapter was on the Sub-Saharan Africa context. And of course, I hope you have read that specific chapter, but if not, looking forward to just giving a bit of a highlight about what we wrote about and then what is in the upcoming publication. So, of course, since 2018, a number of changes have happened in the ecosystem. And part of this roundtables is to have a discussion around what the progression of open data has looked like in Sub-Saharan Africa since. And I mean, just reflecting on why these progressions or regressions have taken place and what we can, as stakeholders in the ecosystem, contribute to making open data a more sustainable initiative, if that is what the outlook for it is. So with that brief introduction, I just wanted to briefly let my panelists introduce themselves, the organizations, and any of their highlights in open data, and then we'll get started with the first section. So welcome, Bernard Sabiti from Uganda.
Thank you, Rio. Again, greetings to everybody. My name is Bernard Sabiti. I'm right now in Kampala, Uganda. I work for Development Initiatives, which is an organization basically interested in the potential of data to change lives. It's headquartered in the UK, but has regional offices in Nairobi and an office in Kampala as well. So it's good to be here, and I'm looking forward to the discussion.
Okay, and Mushiri, who introduced the session, will also be joining the panel, and maybe he can briefly talk about just a bit about his work in open data. Yeah.
A little bit, but I don't know if we have enough time. Yeah, no, I mean, we've been working, of course, around open data directly and open data adjacent issues for a long time now. I think easily easily probably just under the 10-year anniversary of the work that the predecessor to the D4D network, or D4D, Open Data for Development, existed. So a lot of our work was initially focused on catalyzing more open data, catalyzing research around open data, trying to mobilize stakeholders, and really trying to target that policy level to see what can change in order to improve the amount, the quality, and the predictability of open data in our countries. I think over time had a bias. It's an interest, a bias in interest. Some of the areas that we've looked at, I think, have tended to go with where some of our programming is, at least for me as an individual, but then we've also had at LDRI quite a bit of work around gender data, and trying to figure out open government as an entry point for advancing open data as well. I think we have, in one way or another, worked with researchers in 20-some countries over the last few years, with probably more sustained work in about 5 or 6. We're looking forward to this new era, post first edition of the State of Open Data Report.
Thank you, Mushiri. So I'll probably just walk you through the layout of the session. So I'll first do a brief presentation just to highlight some of what we discussed in the initial State of Open Data publication. And then I will very briefly talk about what's in the update, because I think a lot of the discussion here might allude to some of the writing there, but at the same time, it will only act as a teaser so that all of you can take time and read the update to the chapter after the session. And then finally, we'll have a Q&A. And as part of that, we will also be having a panel discussion with Bernard and Mushiri, just to pick their brains about their experience working in open data over the last 5 years and the impressions on what needs to be done moving forward. So without further much ado, I'll share my screen and we can get started. So let me know if you can see. Yes. So the way we structured the chapter was based on a number of topics, and I've highlighted some of the key ones here. The first being when we reviewed the State of Open Data as of 2018, which was about maybe 9-10 years into the movement. The first thing we wanted to reflect on was the ecosystem around open data in the Sub-Saharan African context. And the first thing that we highlighted was that at that point in time, open data primarily was being, sold and being proposed as an avenue to increase transparency, accountability, data reuse, and technology innovation. So ideally, this was really to advance not just democracy within Sub-Saharan African states, but also to promote economic growth. So when open data was starting out, those initial 8-9 years, that was the premise for it. And 3 groups of ecosystem actors really were prominent in the space. Of course, the first being the governments in various countries who were designated as producers of open data. If you remember, open data is ideally a public good, and it is funded by taxpayer funds. Data around citizens and how they engage with their governments. So the government itself were designated as open data producers who are hosting the national portals that were launched as part of open data initiatives, and were required to develop the frameworks to support open data initiatives. Then on the other hand, we had multilateral and development partners who were very active on the continent. Here we are talking about the World Banks and similar entities on IDRC, and these were credited with providing both financial and technical support to open data initiatives. So when you think about those initial ones that were launched by the governments or even by other civil society entities, a lot of the support from a technical perspective as well as from a financial perspective was from the multilaterals operating within Sub-Saharan Africa. And then we had a final group of stakeholders. Ideally, here's where I would group civil society, private sector, and even academia. And they were instrumental in pushing the growth of open data initiatives through by providing the demand for the data sets that will be published on the portals. So in this way, civil society and private sector ideally were the ones going into the portals, downloading the data sets, and creating initiatives around the data hosted in the portals. And a lot of the initiatives were to support technological innovation, citizen engagement, and advocacy. And a number of examples, I'm sure some of your work would fall into this. We knew about the budget in Nigeria that really promoted transparency around the budgets, but there were really few. And in terms of the documented impact, by the time we were writing the chapter, there were, most of the impact for open data was mainly coming from the civil society and very few private sector actors. So at that point, so I'm sort of presenting. Hello? Okay, sorry about that. So I'm presenting this sort of on a timeline basis. So right now we are still in that 2018, 2019 space. And we traced 17 official open data portals at that point. And these were, of course, there are many data portals that governments were hosting, but the ones that were being called, open data initiatives by governments in Sub-Saharan Africa, there were 17 active official ones at that point. And the common data sets included data on demographics. So data generally collected during population census, education, healthcare, agriculture, the usual budgetary data, procurement data, as well as data in the mining industries, oil and gas industry, as well as water and sanitation. So those were the common data sets across these portals. And unfortunately, speaking with different stakeholders and even from literature, these data sets weren't necessarily deemed of high value, primarily because they were at a national level, they were very aggregated. And so if you wanted to utilize them in applications, there was a lot of missing pieces, and it was difficult really to process the data further. So think about, for instance, in the case of healthcare, it's not enough just to know how many hospitals are in each region or in each province. What more can we know about instances of malnutrition within children under 5, for instance? So that was really a lot of the lashback on the data sets published on the portals, that they were very high level. Then other limitations to open data from an Africa-wide perspective were really that the data sets themselves, even when published in official open data portals, were not necessarily licensed. So governments had to really shift their culture of thinking, because previously data was subjected to copyright. It was in very hard formats, such as PDF or even on paper format. So when you're publishing it as open data, licensing is very important to provide people with limits on how to utilize the data. primarily because once you start manipulating, for instance, official statistics, some governments tended to be a bit queasy about what the actual outcome would be. So as I mentioned, data accessibility in terms of accessing the data. So not all the data sets were in machine readable formats. Many of them were scanned copies from hard paper formats, but at that point, we were just happy that this data was being made available online in a manner that people could access and not just in archives in an office. And then finally, depending on the portal, it was really difficult to establish provenance, like who was behind the data set. Was it published as official statistics? Was this a routine data collection process? There's really limited metadata describing how this data was produced and why we should trust it. And then beyond now the technical aspect of things, the other limitations that we saw from these open data portals and described were around digital literacy. So of course, not everyone, and that of course might still be an issue right now, would be able to access these data sets or even know what to do with them, even if they had a link to the portal. Technology access. So open data movements were really centered within urban centers, people with access to the internet who could navigate those portals. And then most of the time, data was produced in English, but as you know, Africa is a very multilingual context. So even if you were to access the data, could you interpret it and utilize it within your own local language context? And so the answer was no to majority of the open data portals that had been published as official statistics. On the other hand, we saw that there were some emerging enabling environmental factors that could support the sustainability of open data, although in 2018, there was quite a lot of work to be done. So at that point, more than 50% of African countries or countries in Sub-Saharan Africa had, even if it wasn't a specific law or a specific entitlement to open data, citizens had the mandate from constitutional processes, but also from access to information laws to access public data. And then the movements that had been taking place over the years, such as the Open Government Partnership, the African peer review mechanisms, were really enabling factors for governments to make commitments towards open data. I mean, for you to participate in OGP, you needed to co-create with your civil society constituents as a government partner on at least creating open government initiatives, with open data being a key open government initiative. Then we also established that most open data initiatives unfortunately rely on political will. So it really depends on who is seated in government from a political standpoint at that time for there to be justification to sustain some of these initiatives. And that also resulted in there not being very well-defined open data policies. So a lot of initiatives were just flying blind in the sense that we were just happy that there was data produced, but in terms of enshrining it, institutionalizing it, ensuring it will be sustainable over time, really was not the case. And so there were very few open data policies implemented at that point. And additionally, because of that lack of regulatory framework to support open data in its own specific use case, was the limited technical and financial support. And here I have to highlight that this is local technical and financial support. So what does this mean? A lot of the initiatives, as I mentioned earlier, were funded by multilateral and donor support. And these really was very good to kickstart some of these movements. But once the granting period or the support period was over, there was a need to sustain these initiatives through local financing, as well as having people within government who can maintain and utilize the data in the portals. So very few initiatives at that point who had actual budget line items or staff members just dedicated to developing these open data sets and maintaining these portals. And then the last thing around the environment in which open data was operating in 2018 was that, as I mentioned earlier, very few instances of impact from initiatives. So we couldn't trace many specific examples of how government itself, for instance, had used its open data to make a specific policy decision across the board. But we did document a number of civil society use cases in transparency, accountability, and of course, moving forward, I'd love to hear your own maybe experiences and examples of governments and private sector and other stakeholders utilizing open data and the impacts realized from that. But in 2018, a lot of it was either related to, OGP commitments like open contracting, like or beneficial ownership, but that was just opening up the data. So the actual impact, let's say reduction in corruption or increased transparency around beneficial ownership, was yet to be documented. And that's why most of the examples are from civil society. So I take a break here in case there's anyone with a burning comment, but the next phase is then, okay, having set this as the baseline for which this current update that we'll be talking about later on, what then have we seen as a progression for the open data movement since 2018 to now? So we'll just briefly take a look and see if there's anyone who asked a question on the chat. Okay. So this image on this particular slide is actually AI generated using a tool called LDRI. And what I was trying to, my query was a watercolor and pencil sketch of African researchers working on open data. So this is what was produced, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on why you think these were some of the images that were generated from a tool such as LDRI. So as I said, I will really gloss over this section, primarily because a lot of our conversation after this will be centered more on these specific topics. But I just wanted to highlight some of the things that we have observed in terms of progression or regression of open data since the state that we had illustrated in 2018. So the first thing is an expanding ecosystem of actors. As in 2018, the way the ecosystem was set up was really almost linear, in as much as there was a bit of movement within each role that the stakeholders were playing. But it was very clear that there was government as owners of the data / hosts of the data. Then we have these institutions supporting it from a technical, financial perspective. And then we have private sector and civil society presenting as sort of drivers for demand for open data. But upon reflecting, we've seen that those dynamics have shifted quite some over the last 5 years, and I'd be happy to discuss this with you and the panelists later on, but we've seen actually more private sector involvement in open data. Why? I hope you will read the chapter to understand why, but think about the Microsofts, the Metas, Amazons, all setting up open data initiatives looking specifically inward at Sub-Saharan Africa. We are also seeing increased activities from other kinds of multilaterals who now are not just, funding government portals, but also looking at sector-specific initiatives such as open data in agriculture, open data in healthcare, and really diving deeper in making those ecosystems thrive. Secondly, we have seen more community-led initiatives. So again, as beyond just government publishing data, civil society utilizing data, or private sector utilizing data, we're actually seeing more initiatives that are brought to the fore and maintained by communities themselves. So by communities, I'm talking about data communities in this space, in this case. So for instance, the agriculture data community has been thriving and produced quite a lot of open data, especially when you think about Earth observation data for artificial intelligence applications, healthcare as well. A lot of the COVID-19 instances that were noted were not necessarily just from government actors, but also community-led efforts to produce data to monitor the pandemic. And definitely AI in general has created a new domain of data, or rather new data communities, such as the natural language processing communities, who are also producing their own open data sets to support the training of models. And conversely, we have stronger use cases for open data, primarily because these community-led initiatives have also created high-value data sets that are more localized, more contextualized, more nuanced than official statistics. And so open data use cases around COVID-19, around food security, as well as around climate change, etc., have been coming to the fore to support specific development use cases within these various sectors. And then in terms of sustainability, I mentioned a lot of the data sets earlier on were published, funded with the government or multilaterals, but now we are seeing that, funny enough, a lot of those 17 portals that we had identified are not active. In fact, maybe less than 7 or 5 are active right now or have been updated in the last 2 years with new data. But that doesn't mean that open data is necessarily dead in those countries. What we have observed is that we are shifting away from such central portals to more sector-driven government portals. And this has also been precipitated by the need to produce SDG-specific data sets to track the country's progressions towards sustainable development goals. So you'll find that this data doesn't necessarily sit in, let's say, Kenya Open Data Initiative, but if you go to a portal like the SDG Forum, you'll find these data sets there. And then finally, given the actual excitement, continued use cases for open data beyond just transparency and accountability, to actual use in development, in tracking disasters, as well as in monitoring social security for citizens, it means that we are not now just making considerations around the technical ability to use data or whether there's a policy to open up the data, but now we are looking at the actual data that will be used for these use cases. How do we talk about issues of inclusivity, issues of ethical access to data, and preserving digital rights of people. Are we seeking consent before we use data in these systems, even if they have been published as open data? And then the way we're using data, are those processes reproducible and transparent, such that we can interrogate how the data is being used to build systems to influence and impact African citizens. So you can see that the conversation is maturing a little bit. It's shifting away from that initial context or not initial contextual issues that were surrounding open data in 2018. And I wouldn't call this necessarily a maturation. It's just that there are new emerging factors, which I'm also looking forward to chatting more about in depth over the next maybe 40 minutes before we end the session. So I'll stop my presentation there, but before I do that, I do want some interactivity from you. So I will pose a question that you can reflect on before we get to, as we are getting into the panel session. And this is my question to you. What notable milestones or points of regressions have contributed to the state of open data in Sub-Saharan Africa based on your experience? Of course, our outlook tried to capture as many experiences as possible, but I'd definitely love to ask this question to you, and I will take time. Maybe if someone already has a comment right now, please just unmute yourself and speak to this as our panelists prepare to come on for the next session. Anyone? Or should I behave like a teacher and point people, request people to speak? Okay, as you're marinating on this, I'll post this question in the chat, but I'll stop sharing and then we can jump into a conversation with Bernard and Mushiri just to hear their reactions on these initial insights on the state of open data in Africa. So thank you so much. And we can get started. Bernard, Mushiri, maybe initial reactions even before I ask you some directed questions on that.
Maybe I'll go fast. I think there's a sense, I think, just listening to you and the work that you've done on this and the work that was done under the Global Data Barometer and the observations that have also come out of the Open Data Inventory by Open Data Watch. I think we're almost at a stagnation, maybe. When it comes to places where we've had advances, things have moved forward. In other areas, what was looking like fantastic progress has kind of disappeared. And I think maybe one of those areas for me was the hope that we had and the focus that we had on these national data portals. You know, we saw them as in a really highly practical way of getting a country's open data agenda to move forward. And I think that national open data portal side is probably the one area I think there has not been the kind of progress we hoped for. But on the other side, we're seeing all this sectoral level, progress, which means fragmentation, proliferation of silos. But I think I'd like to think that that's a good thing, because then you allow the innovators, the early adopters to really pick this up and run with it. And then allow social proof to come in as a way of supporting progress in other parts, so that essentially an organic movement begins to happen within a country, and that could lead to a more organized, centralized effort. but it would have to be a movement that is undergirded by standards. Otherwise, you'd have lots of infrastructure duplicated, not interoperable, and even any effort to bring sanity and coherence would be at the pull out your hair level of frustration. Yeah, but that for me, I think is that whole mixed progress. Places where we're moving, places where we're not. And I think maybe that federated experience might be one that we will begin to see more as a norm, than an exception.
Yeah, I think what you raise is, at some point, will it be more important to make data more discoverable and than centralized, and our data portals, those central data portals, really the answer to it? Yeah, so thanks for that. I'm seeing a couple of reactions on the on the chat, but before I get to you, Adrian, maybe Bernard, you can share a few reactions.
Thank you, Rio, and thank you, Muchiri. I think I agree with Muchiri's reaction. I think the first excitement when the open data movement started, I remember attending probably a couple of conferences in late 2000s, 2009, an open data camp, so-called, in the Netherlands. Then there was a conference, an open data conference at Strathmore University in Nairobi, I think 2010. That must have been my first open data conference in Africa. And there of course, a string of others that followed that. The next couple of years, the excitement around the concept was real. And I think there was a real commitment really for people to put their data out there. The idea that data should be open by default is something that initially excited everybody. But for me, I see two things why there was that kind of depression, if you like, or recession in that excitement around the movement. I think for me, one would be that initially, of course, this was work that was funded almost exclusively by donors. I remember the bank officiating so-called open data readiness assessments in several countries and encouraging governments to open up their data. There was a push for legislation. I think there was, even in Uganda, there is an open data policy that has been a draft for 10 years. I just Googled it to see, is it still a draft? And indeed, it is still a draft on the website of our Ministry of Communications. So I think when you pair the open data movement and also what was being discussed around the wider open government initiative, I think there must have been some sort of skepticism, especially for government partners, about what this really was about. And now you bring along like the impact of social media and the erosion in very many platforms, which by the way was not the case in early 2000s. Many of these platforms are quite new. That's what is even shocking about them, the amount of impact they are having when they are barely 15 years. And now the discussion around the data being available by default seemed to kind of become obvious. And the people in the government now start bringing counter legislations. Thing around data protection, computer misuse. In Uganda, we have some that are really, really ridiculously worded that you can't even determine what their purpose is. In a way, actually, kind of negate some of the ambitions and the priorities of this idea of putting information out there. So in my in part, the cooperation, I could see the cooperation we had from government partners in the early days started reducing. We organized the conference on open data in Kampala, I think in 2012, and it was even hosted in by our Bureau of Statistics. And it's almost unimaginable to think that they would take on an idea like that today. So I think when something is new and looks noble and people were embracing of it, at some point, they started being a little bit skeptical and being suspicious of their intentions. At the same time, also, you realize that when these stakeholders embraced that first, there was this proliferation in data portals, as Muchiri rightly said. And which portals really, it looked as if they were really being put in place out of pressure or out of the need to look maybe part of the trend, but there wasn't really comprehensive plans for these platforms. There is a ministry in Uganda a few years ago where when I was researching silos, and I counted 19 data portals in one ministry. You know, many of them funded different donors. So the blame, as you can see, also goes to the donors, because most of these were funded by donors. And when you look at them, many of them are just similar indicators and all that. So I think that was, in my view, the fear of complete democratization of information from the government side. And again, the over-enthusiasm from the other side now, which led to a lot of proliferation that wasn't coordinated. I think that's probably one of the biggest changes that I have seen on the open data movement.
And thanks for that. I was speaking to one of the researchers in West Africa, and he mentioned some of the things that you've stated, for instance, the proliferation of social media sites and how powerful they are actually have been detrimental, in his opinion, to the open data movement in West Africa, primarily because governments are trying to rein in the people. There's been quite some unrest over the last couple of years, for instance, in Burkina Faso. So they are not trying to open up data. In fact, they're trying as much as possible to make sure that they're shutting down a few of the existing initiatives so that they can, quote unquote, control the democracies. So it's interesting how, yes, in one way, it's made open data open by default right now in a way, but at the same time, it's also created the fear that that is now creating activities that might subvert democracy in their own right. So I'll just pause here for a little bit. I don't know, Adrian, if you'd like to quickly just share your comments on camera, if you don't mind.
Sure, no problem. Hey, good afternoon, everyone. Well, greetings, firstly. Yeah, I think it's interesting because from a South African context, I work for an organization called Open Up, based in Cape Town, South Africa. And we've been fortunate enough to collaborate with national treasury on a couple of budget portals. And what we've picked up is that as a civil society organization, often we lobby for open data access or open data policies or access to data through, through various legislation. So this is I think it's a great initiative on the side of South African government because it's happening at national level, it's happening at provincial level, and also at municipal level. We work with municipalities that are keen to find ways to make data more accessible to their citizens. I think one of the things that we really picked up me as a project manager on some of these projects is that as much as we advocate for access to information, data access, our communities aren't really equipped or capacitated to understand what this information actually means. And so as an organization, we've spent a lot of time trying to make it more understandable as opposed to, yes, we have lots of data, mega data across the country on all fronts, in private sector as well. I think that's where our challenge is, maybe as South Africans, is that the private sector is very reluctant in terms of access to information, and it's a lengthy process to get that kinds of data. But at a governmental level, at the community level, I think there is a lot of room for initiatives around data literacy. And we've gone as far as young people within the spectrum of teenagers at high schools, unemployed youth, to go into communities and train them around aspects of, just basic data literacy, how to access the data, what does it mean once analyzed, how to present that data, and how to then influence decision making. Because at the end of the day, open data, the whole the whole concept of making data available is about informing whoever wants that data. It's about informing that person so that they can make actionable conclusions and go into spaces and influence policy or influence decision making. So I think that's the key thing that we've picked up over the last, I would say, 5 years, working with government and working within communities, that there's still this big divide between the understanding part of the data rather than the access. In South Africa, there's a lot of data that's accessible. It's just a question of, do our communities actually understand that information? Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you so much for those comments. And actually, it's something that we did identify, that really there was that need for intermediaries to really sit between the data that's been published and the citizens themselves, so that it could make the data more useful to them and more understandable to them for their own decision making. And earlier this week, a few ideas were floated about how do we make these data sets more accessible, but not just the data sets, but even the rights, the data rights of grassroots communities. If we're opening up data, if we're using their data in systems, how do we teach them and how do we communicate to them their data rights where they are? So a few things to think about. So I'll probably bring Bernard back onto the stage and ask him a question around, still on the reflections, working in the civil society space, what would you say has been the influence of civil society on the progression or the regression that we have talked about of the open data movement in Sub-Saharan Africa?
Thank you. I think the civil society has played a critical role. At some point, I think we were probably the sole voices on the advocacy side for the open data movement. And even whatever governments did in those areas, I think was largely from engagement led by civil society. Even where some government agencies provided champions, as we used to call them then, in many cases it was from the work that a lot of people in civil society did. So in a way, the movement really was impacted greatly from a positive side by civil society. But also, I have to say this on civil society. We tend to be too jumpy around the new initiatives that come up on the development sector. In many cases, you can understand why, because many of the civil society organizations, of course, want to continue attracting funding. And I don't think we do put our foot down enough to actually say that, even say no to some new ideas, or say that we need to take them on in our own way. But what gains the favor among donors or these foundations and these private foundations, which are becoming even more powerful than traditional donors of late, then immediately they find willing partners by CSOs basically leaving one thing and jumping to the other. the obvious example right now is, for example, AI. AI is now the thing everywhere you look. The idea around the data revolution, which came after open data, even in data governance, that was not a very well-known term a few years ago, you know. But these were now the avenues where there was most funding, and most CSOs now diverted into those areas. I wouldn't probably diverting is a strong word, because these are all related concepts, by the way, all of them. At development initiatives, I even wrote a paper on these terms a few years ago. What do they mean? How do they differ from one another? Because it looks like at some point there are just so many of those terms that people even didn't know which one was which. Because of that, then the focus that was initially, that passion I explained in the areas of the open data movement, then it started to ebb away by some of the champions actually turning to other work, which in one way was really not a good thing. And I think the problem is with the approach that was taken in this diversion. Because when you look at AI, for example, I think open data is at the center of AI. There is no AI, or AI is really not effective without free access to data. And all these things being talked about around the digitalization, for example. What are you digitalizing? If the fundamentals are not strong, which is basically easy access to data, there is no digitalization movement at all, okay? Because when you come to some of these countries, I know there's a lot of talk about leapfrogging or jumping steps in this so-called fourth industrial revolution, but they are basics, they are fundamentals you cannot jump. You must have good, open, transparent and easy to access data to even start talking about these other things, which makes data the most important thing, even is in these new hot topics that we are talking about. So I believe for me, as a civil society, it's about the approach we take. And at development initiatives, we've lost a number of funding opportunities because some of the corals that come through, just look at them, because almost everyone wants to see how to use technology to improve life. But what about in a context where that kind of technology will not start to work unless you address the fundamentals, you see? So for us now, we believe that sometimes as organizations, we need to put our foot down, because we've been in this area for many years. We have the experience, ground experience, than many of these funders. So we need to inform them, educate them on what works, not the other way around. As I said, of course, it's easier said than done, because we also need funding.
I guess it's the whole follow the money situation. Who is doing agenda setting really for these spaces, especially in our context? You damned if you do, damned if you don't. We need to have the fundamentals in place, but we also need to make sure that our work supporting these fundamentals are sustainable. So really interesting perspective on why civil society might look like they are not really contributing to progression of open data in that sense. Jumping to the other side, Mushiri, your work mainly is to support government, public sector initiatives to really use data in evidence-based decision making. Asking you the same question, what has been the influence of government right now in the progression or the regression of open data movement? And here maybe we can even widen the scope a little bit and include multilaterals. Yeah.
Right. First of all, delighted that we have Open Up in the house, Adrian. Big fans of Adi and the work you guys have done and they've been doing for a long time. And I think Open Up is also a good example of an intermediary that comes in to support the public sector for them to really get that job done. Some of the work they've done with the National Treasury on budgets, for instance, I'm sure it's something that the Treasury was happy to have a partner like Open Up working with them to keep that effort going. And I think that is one of the things that we've seen, I think, in the last few years, governments stepping up, getting out of their cocoons and that place where they had this feeling of safety, and come back to the people, the companies, the non-profit organizations that have the technical expertise and saying, you know what, we want to do that. We want to put up, this information there. So of course, some of this has also been driven by the need to comply. And I think in countries where you have a strong legislative regime that is human rights responsive, you find public sector institutions stepping up to comply with access to information, with data protection, with cybersecurity legislation, whatever those legislations might be. And while there is part of that could contribute to some regression, like Bernard noted earlier, in some countries, how that legislation is framed can be either progressive or regressive. Where it's progressive, governments have been a catalyst for the reawakening of open data. And you're seeing this where especially there are champions, where there are institutions with interest. For a while, those have been the statistics offices. Where you have an independent national statistics office, you can expect that they will have interest in moving and pushing the envelope where these things are concerned, where they are nervous about whether they'll have their job in the next morning. If they do that, of course, you don't get to see that kind of progress. We're seeing it with ministries for agriculture in the space that I look at quite a bit. We had the ministry here in Kenya reach out for help with the initial version of the Open Data Portal, and it's a ministerial level one. We supported that for a couple of years, and then a government institution has now stepped up and updated and put up a brand new portal. So the government is now sorting itself out on open data, which is a very exciting thing to see, because they're not going to license software. This is an open source solution internally done. So that's a signal, that when you see government stepping up and putting its own resources, its own time to do something like this, then that's a good signal of sustainability. That data is going to be around, and that data portal is going to be around, serving the needs of the government and as well as other stakeholders for a while to come. There are in addition to that, voting with your wallet signal, that tells you whether there's progress or not. I think the absence of policy has both been a good thing and a bad thing, and I think maybe the absence has helped people in government make braver moves in places where there's a legal lacuna. Of course, there are instances where people hold back until they're very clear what the law is, but where there's some level of comfort. I've seen that with Sierra Leone, for instance. The Open Data Council there and now the news agency being very keen to advance on open data and try and find new ways to make that work within their context. You can tell that there's progress there, even if there's no explicit open data legislation. So I think I'm not as worried as I used to be about whether government is doing its role to catalyze open data through legislation and policy, because really those are a remedy. And if they already have some kinds of other remedies sorting out the current problems on access to data and the opening up of it, then maybe the answer might not be a new tool, a new legislation or whatever. Whatever currently exists might actually be good enough to move things forward. Multilateral institutions, I think they've been pretty useful. World Data Forum, an edition ago, was very open data focused. And that really pushed that agenda into more NSOs. I was still hoping to see COVID kind of disrupted, our progress there, but we did get to see, I think, a lot more open data, especially around COVID, like you mentioned. And I think that may have had a significant contribution from the level of the UN, WHO, and others. And I think that might be at the beginning of seeing a whole lot more of that happen. At the continental level, the African Union now has this move around the data policy, the data governance policy. These kinds of instruments, once they make landfall in country, can have a catalytic effect on MDAs, on ministries, departments, and agencies across government that probably didn't even know that there's a continental instrument being domesticated. So I think there are those examples of places where government is making progress regardless of the constraints or the opportunities that give them reason not to move forward. But I'm also keenly aware that the constraints that really hold us back, especially financial resources, continue to be a pressing problem. The contestation, between something like opening up data vis-a-vis, improving food security. I think food hunger, etc., is always going to trump investments in making data, data initiatives work. But the likelihood is the kind of collaborations like I've seen now with the Kenyan Ministry of Agriculture, reaching out to FAO, working with the National Research Agency to build a new edition of the portal, tells you that there is innovation happening. People are looking for ways to move between the cracks and still get the job done. So, where government is not helping at all, I think those are examples that would be spoiled for choice to find. But that I think is also one of the most important reasons why we need to think about data in the context of human rights. That, by the time open data was coming along, we already had a long-standing open access to information movement globally. Right to information, access to information, whatever you want to call it. Maybe to some extent, Bernard was about civil society's role here. Maybe some things became so new and shiny that we did not bring along the fundamentals into the new conversations around it. And that is why I really like what we're doing with the GDB now. We're not just looking at open data, but we're looking at environmental factors as well that determine whether data sharing, whatever form it takes, can really take in a country. And those, I think, are things that now governments start looking at and start using for making decisions or responding, because it's an advocacy lever as well, so that they can advance and get better scores, whatever incentive that these things give them. But I think that holistic look at data is one that is going to serve us well. And I think maybe one that we're going to start seeing signals of it being picked up within government, multi-sectoral, intersectoral approach, whatever you want to call it.
Yeah, and just picking up on a couple of things you've said, for sure, Professor Ndemo actually early in the week was talking about how they had to literally break the law, to set up the Kenya Open Data Initiative. The Official Secrets Act would not permit, these kind of initiatives to exist. And yet that's why we are saying we're not too worried about the government itself needing some of these mechanisms to start, but I think they're really critical though to sustain. So it's one thing to have the initiatives launched, but the sustenance now brings in the point you're saying around, financing this and creating resources to really move them around. One thing I'm wondering is, given, for instance, what we saw about how data impacted the response to COVID-19, would that be a strong use case, for instance, now to push for creating open data really to support other response mechanisms and the development agenda that the government might have? Because it was so clear that if we weren't monitoring the spread of COVID-19 with numbers, even how the public reacted to that data being public, then maybe we wouldn't have arrested it in the number of years that we managed to. So when we look into other sectors, what opportunities do such use cases that are very solid provide for government to invest?
We're in this era now. I think in the beginning, 10, 12 years ago, open data and more open data was the call. Just put out a lot of it. We used to have these conversations about high value vis-a-vis low value open data, and that high value data tended to be highly politically expensive data. So the kind of data we always wanted to push for, which was like super granular expenditures data, for instance, would not make its way out because the political cost of opening up that data is too high. So the move into these scenarios of crisis response, I think, have taught us that people are willing to step out of that cushy, safe place if the pain relief makes sense for them. And I think with COVID, we saw this open data bringing significant concrete opportunities for pain relief, making decisions, innovating on tools, educating the public. That whole civic awareness thing made a lot of sense. If we can identify and continue to identify in our countries areas where the public sector is really struggling to get a job done, and the scenarios or potential use cases, can be supported by open data, I think that becomes a catalyst that we can use to advance things. And that is why I'm no longer as worried about the absence of national initiatives. But if we have federated, interoperable, standardized platforms, let 1,000 flowers bloom, as long as the flowers can talk to each other if they need to. That's a more realistic goal to reach for, because each flower is solving a problem, and there are people willing to water and nourish that flower as long as it continues doing what it's supposed to do. Any flowers we build for ourselves as civil society, thinking that we're going to be solving a problem for the public sector, just means the moment the money is over, the flower is uprooted and maize is planted.
Very true.
I'm running away with that analogy now.
I was like, okay, we're really focused on these flowers and
maize.
Okay, I'll take maybe a quick breath over here, see if anyone has some questions, some contributions. And please just feel free to unmute your mic or raise your hand, whichever you're more comfortable with. And yeah, we'll get to you. We have a few minutes left and just one round of questions. So anyone? Okay, or as they're thinking their question, maybe I can come back to you, Bernard, and ask you, okay, now that you're saying that as civil society practitioners, we are attracted by the next shiny thing or where the funding carrot is dangled, I'm really hoping maybe I'll be given an opportunity to reflect on this in another 3 to 5 years, in another publication, if people are not too bored by my style of writing. But yeah, ideally in those 3 to 5 years, what do you think will be the conversation around open data? Where do you think this is going over the next few years? You're muted, sorry.
Sorry. Yeah, so me really, the very first thing I think I would like to see is for the veterans of the movement, especially. I would like to count myself among them. And Muchiri definitely is one of them as well. Is basically to place open data at the center of all these new ideas that are coming. Because it's really not an old concept, or it has not lost its relevance. It's still very much relevant. I think all the ideas that many of these new movements are built upon is about open and democratization of free sharing of data and information. And for me, that really needs to be the new message. I think there needs to be studies now. I remember we did all imaginable studies on the impact of open data. I don't know if Muchiri remember in 2014, under that ODDC, the Open Data in Developing Countries project, was that the LDRI, Team Davis, and we were studying basically all sorts of angles of open data many years ago. I would like, and thank you for the person who shared that blog by the director of Open Data Watch on the importance of basics, and indeed very, very relevant. But I would like to, for example, see a study that interrogates the relevance of open data in artificial intelligence, or the data governance, or digitalization indeed. As I was saying, you cannot really even start to think about digitalization if the data is not open. Machine reading, remember those concepts we used to think about those many years. So I think we need to make sure that we make the movement relevant. It is still indeed very relevant. And again, when you see all this backlash coming in terms of negative legislation coming out, as you said, Leo, it's actually the origin of that is open data. I think for some actors, it became too much. The whole idea of putting government online, what does that even mean? And so, but again, of course, we know that when data and information are easier to access, it's better for everybody, not just for anyone pushing it, but it's better for everybody. And I would like to actually take some hope in some very small indicators of progress, even amidst some of the negativity around the legislation, especially. I think it says a lot to see that some public agencies, while some of them enforce data access roadblocks or even legislation, they also want their data to be out there. I can't tell you how, and I saw on one of your maps, you actually showed some of these data portals hosted by national statistical organizations. I think by my last counting, when you go to their website, you probably see more than 10 open data portals. So even traditional, I call them traditional agencies, or traditional, mostly public agencies that tend to be skeptical of these new ideas, they actually cherry pick positive aspects of these new ideas, like making sure that their data is open and easy to access. So we can take advantage of that and say, actually, your own behavior is a good case study for why open data is a good thing. So when you look at some of the way traditionally how data was collected, like censuses, the way censuses are being conducted today, it's completely surprising, amazing, the progressiveness. I think they are now talking about something they are calling digital census. What is digital census? In Uganda, we are planning one in 2023, and the Bureau of Statistics has been all over the media saying we are doing a digital census. The data will be available in a week for everybody. And I'm excited about that because they are realizing that it doesn't help anyone to do such an important data collection exercise, and people wait 6 months before they know what the outcomes were. So they've been approached of all these devices and creating awareness. So you can see that actually they have come to our side, which is, in my view, a very good thing. So in my view, I think in terms of what is going to make the movement sustainable is to continuously point out its good things. I think the movement birthed most of these cool, so-called cool initiatives that we are looking at, which we know about 10 years ago. And so we need to point that out. And there is evidence to that. There is evidence to that. When you the first portals of the 2010s, they are not perfect, but they have led to, much more positive attitudes towards sharing data. So in my view, I know some studies have really bashed these portals. Everybody is against silos. You don't create, or not another dashboard for heaven's sake and whatever, but they forget that these portals opened the discussion for what was possible. Now we are having too much of that, and now it's a bad thing, but we cannot forget that it was important that somebody trialed these portals from the beginning. So we need to be tuned to what's happening and then look back at how great this movement was at the beginning. And its motivations are still correct. They are not wrong.
Yeah, I really liked that point on tightly interlinking the open data movement with the other emerging trends around the actual data use, AI, what have you. And of course, even our hosts today are D4D, previously open data for development. And I see that realization is across the board. So the question is, even as we're talking about AI-specific projects, or not projects, but issues, as well as big data issues, etc. How do we still center the conversation around opening up data, which is a fundamental aspect to where the world is progressing in this space? Mushiri, any thoughts on this? Like, what should we be talking about, or where do we see ourselves in the next 3 to 5 years when it comes to open data?
No, thank you. I think some of the old issues are still going to be in play. So I mentioned the Open Up and the work they've been doing with budget, for instance, in South Africa. Well, budget, you mentioned budget from West Africa. Despite the existence of a lot of this work, continentally, we are still not doing well on budget transparency and expenditures transparency. And I think that is going to continue being an area easily into the next 5 years or so. What's going to be different, in my view, with no science and no research to back up my thought, just my gut feeling and just seeing what the trends look like, is the analysis of the data.
We're having a data conversation here, so we can't.
Data conversation. Yeah, but the data in my gut, and I have consumed a lot of it over the last few years, I will have you know. I think what is going to be the biggest difference is how we analyze the data that's being put out there. And I think AI may actually be a catalyst for new and more better data as people begin to seek better answers, and better insights. I think it's going to be an incentive to put out more data into the space. I'm hoping it won't be data overload and create new problems. But I'm seeing some of the old things continuing into the future, like advocacy on open data for budget and whatever else is big in our countries. But then this new layer that brings a new level of excitement to what data can do because of the emerging technologies. I think we're seeing a bit of that in agriculture. We're seeing a little bit of that in some of the sciences. And we're seeing the disruptive potential thanks to ChatGPT. And they still won't let us play with 4. Anyway, so the biases from your image, I saw an interesting bias there about Africans. You know, we dress a certain way. You know, there's no African there with a puffer jacket. You know, with an Italian 3-piece suit. I didn't see the sagging jeans. And
the computer itself.
Yeah, I didn't see them working on a computer with open data. It's not like we're beating out cereals, you know. You know, that's a bias that's built into the data. But we want to see, you know, I'm hoping that we're going to see a little bit more deliberate efforts to address bias, develop more indigenous tech, and then consequently also, you know, better, safer environments for data use, data publishing and data use. I think maybe that's a general direction. Many things, but you know, that general, you know, direction.
Yeah, I agree with that. And I personally like to refer to our mission back at LDRI, you know, how we support public institutions, but generally around the thematic areas of human capital, enabling environment, and sustainable financing. And I think the data space, open data specifically, still has gaps in each of these 3 major areas, which would ideally push the open data movement to that space we were dreaming about back in 2010, would refocus us back on ensuring that the fundamentals are still squared out. When initial initiatives went out, we were happy with PDFs and we were happy with just scans of data, but we still need to, as Bernard was saying, the songs we used to sing, the 5-star standards of open data, I don't think they are irrelevant now, just because, let's say, we're looking at open data in the context of AI or what have you. So we still need to set the right infrastructure to support the proliferation of open data initiatives. But at the same time, I think we are better able now to articulate uses for open data and use cases where open data is truly beneficial to the populace. So it's just a matter of using that to incentivize more work and more focus on this space, even as we link up open data to AI. So I would say those would be my closing remarks. And I don't know if there's any housekeeping, any next steps that Moshe, maybe you can guide us on, or anyone from the D4D team. I'm still happy to field questions in the next 3 minutes, but I appreciate your attention and thank you so much for joining us. Yeah.
Well, thank you, Leo. This was an amazing session, and we have one more in the series coming up in 30 minutes. Fiona, am I right? Or is my calendar?
Yes, it's coming up in 30